block transactions that it felt would in various ways undermine the security of the ICT infrastructure in the United States. And one of the things that I think a lot of people in my area thought at the time was that that was really an executive order kind of focused on 5G infrastructure, focused on Huawei, focused on the underlying architecture of the network more than it was focused on some of the sort of software layer apps and services. And as that executive order was clarified a little bit with some of the rules being drafted by the Commerce Department, it started to look like that was actually sort of an underestimation of what the administration had in mind in passing that executive order. It started to look more like there was going to be a very broad authority for the Commerce Department to come in and block transactions, that some of the sort of the previously established regimes under CFIUS, for instance, about pre-clearing transactions might not exist, and that we were actually dealing with a sort of much larger set of concerns and a much wider kind of range of the network stack. That is not just that technical infrastructure, but everything up to the software and application layer as well. And I think one of the things that the WeChat and TikTok executive orders really made clear was this interest of the administration in cracking down not just on the 5G infrastructure, the hardware that goes into building the networks, but also on that software layer and thinking about sort of what are some of the security concerns that may be involved there. And one of the things that's sort of been pointed out to me when I've written about this issue is that there's much more than just cybersecurity involved in a lot of these discussions and decisions being made by the administration. So I do want to highlight that. For me, what I focus on primarily are those security risks. And so that's most of what I'm going to talk about. And I think part of what's tricky and what I imagine the administration will find challenging about trying to do this is that the cybersecurity risks that you worry about at the infrastructure layer when you're talking about building a network are very different from the cybersecurity risks that you worry about in an app like WeChat. And so when you're trying to sort of think about a comprehensive one-size-fits-all policy regime for tackling all of the different types of security vulnerabilities at those different layers of the network, it can become very confusing. It can become sort of very unclear how these same rules are going to apply to all those different pieces. And part of what I think will be interesting to watch in the coming months is how the US government sort of approaches this issue of trying to essentially localize the data that is being collected by WeChat, by TikTok, and move it to United States companies, move it to United States control, given that so much of sort of their prior policy up to this point around data security has been very focused on the idea that they do want to have lawful interception access for data that's stored overseas, that they don't want to be encouraging a regime of data localization, which, for instance, China has been pushing very strongly with their cybersecurity law. So I'm going to pause there and turn things over to Nate to give a little bit of the legal perspective, just saying that sort of in the policy context, what we're looking at here is the United States really changing course a little bit in how it thinks about the cybersecurity threats posed by foreign software. We haven't seen the US government attempt to block software at the app layer in this way before. We've seen India do this most recently with some Chinese apps. It's been implemented in that case through the intermediary app store and app marketplaces, which has been a fairly effective way of trying to block access to those apps, but has not necessarily been a model that we think of as being used by the United States or the United States government in that way previously. It's certainly been used by the Chinese government to block access to certain VPNs and other types of services that way. And that would be sort of the most likely implementation that I could imagine for these executive orders. But it's so contrary to so much of the sort of policy narrative and positions that we've seen coming out of the US government in the past about what the internet should look like and what internet security should mean, that it's also a little bit hard to predict how exactly that will be interpreted and implemented.
Great. Well,
thank you, Professor Wolf. Yeah, please, Nate, over to you.
Thanks, Professor Wolf. Thanks, Jake. Good to see so many familiar faces, and thanks to the U.S. China Business Council for inviting me to speak today. It certainly, as Jake said, and as Professor Wolf just eloquently stated, it's a very uncertain time we're in terms of how this is going to be implemented. I'm going to try to read the tea leaves a little bit and give some guidance as to the potential likely direction that the Commerce Department will take in implementing this executive order. So as Jake was mentioning, the executive order sets out a time frame to implement it by September 20th. I think we're on track so far to see that. Unclear exactly whether we'll get anything in advance of that date, given that it falls over a weekend, or whether it will push over to the following Monday. But I think for now, we should assume that we're going to see something from the Commerce Department on or about September 20th. What that will look like, well, I think there's no accident that this announcement, this executive order, came out within 24 hours of Secretary of State Pompeo's speech about the expansion of the Clean Initiative, which is and has historically been focused on the infrastructure issues that Professor Wolf was just explaining. But to expand that to include clean apps, clean cloud, clean data, these are concepts that indeed specifically mention Tencent, specifically mention the presence of Chinese-made apps on app stores in the United States, as well as the use by Chinese mobile operators and app distributors of US apps in China. So it's very clear that this is sort of the direction the administration is going. There's a link very clearly drawn between that policy statement and what the administration is doing here. And I think we can expect that it will be implemented fairly broadly. Now, how exactly would that be done? Well, first of all, I think we can take some clues from the way that the executive order delegates authority. We have an executive order that's issued under the authority of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, often referred to as IEPA. And that is the same statute that has been used to authorize US sanctions against Iran and a host of other countries over many, many decades. Historically, authority under IEPA will be delegated not to the Commerce Department, but to the US Treasury Department to implement under a section of the Treasury Department known as OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control. Those delegations typically take the form of a total ban on any type of transactions with designated entities under IEPA. Contrast that with Commerce's authority and the way that Commerce historically administers listings of specific entities on the entity list or denial orders and denied parties, which is much more limited and typically focuses on, first of all, activity that involves some kind of export, re-export, or transfer of US goods, technology, or software outside the United States, does not typically have a key focus on financial transactions overall or services transactions. And so I think it's likely that we can take some guidance and potentially see this take the form of something like the denial order that we saw in place for a short period of time with regard to ZTE back in 2018. Some of you, probably many of you will recall, that was a fairly broad-ranging denial order. It prohibited a lot of export activity, of course. It also prohibited in some cases, the assistance of US persons in activities that could lead to an export of US technology to ZTE. And the potential is there to take that as a model and craft something that would apply to the WeChat app in particular, that would be focused not so much on individual use of WeChat either in the United States or overseas, but on the touch points of that app to the US telecommunications network and infrastructure, so that the order could designate potentially restrictions on telecom providers in making the WeChat app available, supporting it through the use of US technology that's subject to the Export Administration regulations, other things of that nature that effectively don't prohibit the use of WeChat overall, but would potentially prohibit the use of it using US platforms, US technology, potentially US operating systems, whether that is Android or iOS or what have you. And so there would be a number of limits that would be drawn around it, potentially, again, focused on where those activities would potentially involve exports of US technology. So again, we don't have any clear indication that that's the direction the administration is going to go, or Commerce Department will indeed take that as their marching orders, but there is precedent there. There is a platform potentially to draw some lines around the executive order and implement it in a way that is more limited than a blanket ban for all people who are subject to US jurisdiction anywhere in the world, including subsidiaries of US companies operating in China, and have it more limited to the use of US telecommunications network and infrastructure within the United States and the use of the app within the United States. And that, I think, is consistent with some of the press reporting we've been seeing recently about meetings with the administration and White House, which seem to be offering some assurances that although they're moving ahead with the ban, it's going to be focused on the use of the technology within the United States. The final thing I'd add here is just kind of looking ahead as to where this may go, given that we're about 68 days out from the November elections. And I think a lot of people are looking at this in the context of, well, if we see a Biden administration, will these kinds of activities continue? Are we going to be living with this for a long time if we see that, or is it going to be a relatively short-term phenomenon? I think it's important to keep in mind the context here from some things that Congress has passed over the past 2 years, all of them with extremely wide margins of support from both parties. And one of them I particularly wanted to highlight is the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, or something known as FIRMA. That is an act that expanded CFIUS jurisdiction significantly. And what's quite notable about it is it drew this very clear direct link between the personal information of US citizens and national security risks. It defined a whole new category of personally identifying information, defined what that was. The implementing regulations have gone on to give further details about how that is controlled. And it draws a very direct link between this idea that access to US citizens' data has national security implications, and that is something that the US government can and should regulate, and should do so because there are threats to US national security. So I think we can potentially take that as some indication that we're going to be living with something like this for the longer term. And I think there's a consensus within the intelligence community and the national defense establishment on both sides of the aisle that says this is an ongoing threat and the US needs to do something about it. And potentially we'll see the momentum of this order, whatever it is, be something that has a longer lifespan than potentially just a short period of time until the election. So I think it's important to take away from that it's worth preparing, worth trying to engage in some activities to understand your supply chain, the touch points of WeChat to that supply chain and your distribution networks, and particularly as that may touch activity within the United States, and be prepared for this to be something of a longer term development.
Thank you both so much for those opening remarks. I think Nate finished on a useful point that we can help pivot to a question that's come in for Professor Wolf. Be interested in understanding how these actions are taken by the administration today, particularly in kind of the software realm, would evolve and extend into a potential Biden administration.
It's a great question. So my instinct is that cybersecurity and perhaps all security related rules and regulations are harder to roll back just because politicians often start to feel like it makes it look like they're not being serious about cybersecurity. I think, so that is to say, I think that under a different president right now, it's probably quite unlikely that the WeChat executive order would have come to be, but that if it is implemented, it may be harder for a Biden administration to sort of think through the optics of reversing. I don't think that means it will necessarily stay in effect. What I would say, and this builds on some of the points that Nate was making really eloquently about sort of the different modes of implementation, is that an executive order like this can be implemented at many different levels and enforced at many different levels. And so what I would expect is if you see this implemented under the Trump presidency, and to be honest, there's been so much sort of back and forth and reversal that it's a little hard for me to predict even exactly what that will look like. You might start by seeing the administration try to lean really heavily on Apple and Google to remove the WeChat app from their app stores and marketplaces, for instance. I think it's very possible they will face more resistance from those companies, and that may be a sort of more drawn out process than they anticipate. But if they start with those intermediaries, which I would guess, that would be my sort of instinct, that instead of going through the telecom networks and sort of trying to get all of the different mobile service providers to restrict traffic to those apps. They're going to go through the operating system manufacturers, both because they've in general been sort of much more focused on cracking down on those companies, and because it's quicker and easier. Just technologically speaking, to say, I want these apps out of the marketplace, I want them off the phones in this country, than it is to sort of go through all of the different ISPs and try to work out those restrictions there. And what I would say is, I think, and again, I'm completely making this up, that under a Biden administration, you would probably start to see a relaxing of that rule. I would imagine something closer to, say, the legislation proposals around blocking some of these apps on government devices, or privately owned devices even of military employees, and less about restricting them at that sort of general app store marketplace level. I want to reiterate that's complete speculation, and it is sometimes harder than I anticipate, and I think than politicians themselves anticipate, to take policy stands that look like they're rolling back security protections. But I would expect to see, I would hope to see a Biden administration that was more focused on infrastructure security, more interested in the question of sort of what 5G networks and physical infrastructure in the country is going to look like and how to secure that, and less interested in trying to go after some of the big mobile operating systems and crack down on what software they're providing.
Thank you. Let me ask a secondary follow-up question to that. I think that Professor Wolf alluded to this, as did Nate. This WeChat executive order obviously has a specific impact on industry, but the framework under which it will be implemented, this ICTS regulation, would appear to empower the Department of Commerce with new regulatory authority that could be implemented quite broadly and impact industry in the future. Something that I've been talking to companies about when they ask about a Biden administration is they will be empowered with this new authority, whether they like it or not. And it seems unlikely that they would roll back that framework and would be much more likely to use it to whatever their policy ends are in the future. And I just wonder if you could talk about this ICTS and whether you expect it to be applied broadly beyond the WeChat executive order going forward.
So I think you're absolutely right. No administration is going to say, look, we have these, cool new authorities, let's give them back. And I don't say that just to be sort of snarky. I think there are good reasons for the Commerce Department to be thinking about ICT security, and that's not a terrible place for them to focus. I do think the ICTS framework that's set up, and it's still quite new, right? We just had the first kind of rules about it late last year coming out in proposal. So we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. It seems to sort of take the broadest interpretation of what types of transactions the Commerce Department can block and when they can block them and how they can do it sort of without input. And again, I don't know how much of this is sort of wishful thinking versus actually, useful crystal ball gazing. I would expect a Biden administration to hold on to those authorities. I would imagine that a lot will depend on who is running the Commerce Department under that administration, and in particular, sort of for this set of issues, how they feel about China and sort of the threat of the Chinese economy and tech companies in particular. I would not be surprised if some of the sort of hostility towards Huawei and Chinese involvement in the 5G infrastructure translated over into a Biden administration. And I would expect to see some of those ICTS authorities being pretty aggressively applied around things like routers and switching and maybe even smartphones and some of the other areas we've seen sort of interest and focus there. I'd be really surprised if it was going to be used under a Biden administration to block transactions of microprocessors. I think, right now, especially if you're focused on trying to bolster the economy in the United States, that would seem like a really sort of counterintuitive choice. And I would also be surprised if it was going to be used to go after a lot of apps. Whether that's WeChat, TikTok, or anything else. I think that sort of trying to restrict access to online content, right? And again, to me, because because of the way that sort of we think about the internet from a technical perspective, there's a really big difference between that software layer and that infrastructure layer. And one of the differences is that if you find a serious vulnerability in a piece of software, you can change that really quickly, which is not true of the infrastructure underlying your entire network, right? If you build a lot of hardware into your 5G network and it turns out there are vulnerabilities in there, that's a years-long, incredibly expensive process. If tomorrow we find, serious technical vulnerability in WeChat, then that's the kind of change that can be made very quickly. So I would anticipate, again, with all caveats, that the ICTS authority is going to be used to think about physical infrastructure that's being built in the United States. It's going to be used to think about sort of the protocols and supply chain for building out, especially the 5G networks, but also other types of network infrastructure we're thinking about for broadband right now, but less that it's going to be used around microprocessors and less that it's going to be used around sort of particular software and apps under a Biden administration. And perhaps a year from now, we will come back to this and laugh at it.
And Nate, if I could, as a longtime practitioner dealing with some of these regulatory authorities that impact American companies and their interactions with foreign companies, how do you see this framework being deployed beyond just the WeChat app?
Yeah, I agree with Professor Wolf's comments. I think it's unlikely that any administration would give up the executive authority just, flat out. It's likely to either go on the shelf or be used in more constrained ways, depending on who we see in the next 4 years in office. But in terms of how this might be implemented, I think the executive order has been viewed as kind of a gap filling measure. And let me just kind of try to illustrate where the administration may see that there's some gaps in overall telecommunications policy and the national security touch points of that. You have, of course, CFIUS and FIRMA, which I mentioned, which address investments in US businesses by foreign parties. And that, of course, kind of takes care of the acquisition piece of it. You have U.S. export control laws and sanctions laws, which deal primarily with outbound transactions. And so the sharing of information of technology or software with companies like Huawei, and that is another area where I think the administration feels it has a pretty solid set of tools to deal with risks that it has been identifying. And the remaining gap kind of is in this intermediate infrastructure piece of it, where you have things that are not quite an investment in a U.S. business. They're also not things that may necessarily need a license from the FCC, which, by the way, has also been focused very much on this issue. And so it's more in the way of imports of software technology goods that may go into some kind of an infrastructure. And so what we may start to see is a limited implementation of that rule focused on those touch points. And again, there is some precedent for that with the Commerce Department. It goes back a ways, but they have been charged with and have regulated in the past imports of certain items that are viewed to present some kind of risk to U.S. national security. Interestingly, again, under this IEPA authority, so you can look at the oil imports back in the 70s. This was an issue as well, where there was some activity by the Commerce Department to regulate that piece of it. Not exactly analogous, but the point is that there is some precedent for that, and I think that is one gap that kind of exists in the statutory regulatory authority from the perspective of the Commerce Department right now, is the ability to handle something that is viewed as a threat, goes into the infrastructure and telecommunications, or, in the words of some administration officials, siphoning up of US citizens' data, and yet is not something that falls squarely within the regulatory authority of any of these other existing agencies or structures. And so we may start to see it as kind of a gap filling measure in that way.
That's really helpful. Thank you for laying out those different formulas that are used in thinking about these different regulatory authorities. I have a question for you, Nate. And as someone who's worked in the Department of Commerce, this one may be uniquely suited for you to answer. One of our guests is interested in understanding your views on the working relationship between NTIA, who's the implementer of the ICTS, BIS, the Bureau of Industry and Security, and the State Department. How are those three working together? How are they collaborating? And any thoughts that you could share would be helpful.
Sure. Well, there are a number of historical connections between all those interest groups within Commerce and its state. And certainly the Bureau of Industry and Security has a number of processes for an interagency collaboration or vetting of various proposals. I think that's likely going on at the moment with regard to the implementation of the latest executive orders. Almost certainly But I think this is one that has been delegated primarily directly to the Secretary's office at the Commerce Department. So I think, and Secretary Ross has shown in the past a great willingness to not be particularly bound to historical dividing lines within the Commerce Department, but to bring together groups of people who have expertise in an issue on a kind of ad hoc nature to address whatever the issue is. And so I think we can expect, number one, a tremendous amount of crosstalk and collaboration among all those interest groups, but also something that's going to be coordinated very much at a senior policy level. This is very much driven by a close circle of the leadership at State Department, Commerce Department, within Peter Navarro's office, the White House as well, and within the Director of National Intelligence. These are all stakeholders who have a significant amount of say in how this goes into effect and how it will be shaped. And I think they'll try to flexibly use all those existing infrastructure pieces at Commerce, but we may start to see them used in ways that they haven't historically been.
Thank you. A question for both of you. One of the things that Nate brought up in his remarks was the potential restrictions on telecom providers that the U.S. government may take. One of our questions is interested in what kind of Chinese response we might expect. How would the Chinese retaliate against U.S. industry is, I think, the underlying question for the U.S. taking this approach towards Chinese companies. Professor Wolf, maybe we can start with you, and then Nate, anything you'd like?
It's another great question that requires me to be better at predicting the future than I am. In terms of blocking popular American apps, China already does that and has done that for a long time. So you could imagine sort of a continuation in that direction. The biggest target, and I'm sure they're thinking very seriously about this right now, is probably Apple. And the question of sort of what happens if China decides to take out some of its frustration about this, either on the Apple supply chain and the parts of that are dependent on Chinese resources, or on Apple's technology and their devices, which have done very well in China and which they've been sort of working pretty hard to maintain that relationship over the past few years, often at the cost of a fair bit of sort of negative attention towards Apple. So I think that's one area. And that's one of the reasons why I think that sort of if you see this move forward with the US government leaning on Apple to block WeChat and TikTok from the iPhone App Store, you're going to see a fair bit of resistance. I think Apple's not either going to want to be in the position of other governments looking at it as a tool for doing that, or to be in a position of making China really angry with it. I think another possible source of retaliation is going to be around Microsoft, depending on sort of how things shake up with the talks between Microsoft and TikTok to purchase their US business or some of their North American business. That's another big US-based company which still does a lot of business in China. And you could imagine a retaliation that was focused more on Windows and Microsoft Office. It's a little hard to know what it would be replaced with right now, right? There aren't kind of obvious, easy alternatives, but I'm sure that's another source of concern for Microsoft at least, and for other people. And I think, I think the sort of the grandest, most cosmic retaliation, which was already in process, is probably going to come in the efforts to on Chinese-made 5G technology in the upcoming networks. And I think you're going to see probably more aggressive pushes to sell really, really low-cost infrastructure to other countries, to place as much pressure as possible on other places to be building out their infrastructure with Chinese technology. And probably also sort of the increased pushes that we've already begun to see for China to manufacture its own chips, for China to be able to sort of not rely on the US tech supply chain itself, which will be very hard on the US, I think, long term, but will also be a much slower process, right? The sort of process of China embedding itself in 5G tech networks worldwide, the process of them developing their own microprocessors, that's a years-long process. That's not something that's going to happen in the next month or two.
Before we get your response, Nate, I just wanted to add one additional caveat to that question that we've just received. Any thoughts on how China may retaliate, particularly related to the unreliable entity list that has been announced but not yet published? Any thoughts you have would be great.
Huh. I don't know if I have sort of very different thoughts on what the retaliation there might look like. I think you could start to see China sort of compiling more extensive lists of US companies and parties that it will not allow people to do business with. There are darker responses you can imagine too, right? There are 2 Canadians who have been charged sort of in retaliation for the arrests tied to Huawei. There are even more aggressive things that China is sometimes willing to do that we could imagine in this space. But I would say that was a more specific response to a Chinese executive being arrested. So I would imagine, based on what they've done so far, that Chinese response to that list would be sort of something more analogous to making a list of entities that they themselves will not allow transactions with or will not allow access to the Chinese internet for.
Nate, any thoughts from you on this?
Yeah, I agree with all those points. I think that to a certain degree, the ability to respond like for like to what the U.S. is doing is somewhat limited on China's part, both because there are a lot of bans already on U.S. apps within China, but also because I think there's certainly a linkage to the Chinese economy and the development of technology in China that really supports Professor Wolf's last point, which is this is something that China is likely to respond to primarily by just accelerating all the efforts it's been engaged in already to come up with alternatives to US and other Western sources of technology and software in these exact areas. And so we may eventually see an effective ban on US technology companies operating in China, but it may not be because they're added to a list. It may just simply be because they've been supplanted by China's own efforts to come up with alternatives that it then pushes both within the Chinese market and also around the world through initiatives like Belt and Road and other initiatives like that. And so it's kind of there could be some token designations of US officials, as we saw with regard to the Huawei ban and other things recently, but probably the bigger push, the bigger response is going to come in that area of development of alternatives and further kind of pushing out of some of the US companies that has historically had some room to operate within China. But that's a longer term process, I think.
And Nate, let me stay with you for the next question. It's about something you raised in your remarks, particularly the Clean Network Plan that state had announced before this executive order was released. And we've had some questions about if you could offer any additional insights on what the Clean Network Initiative would look at, particularly the pieces related to untrusted apps, untrusted app stores, and then the cloud-based systems accessible to foreign adversaries. So 3 of the 5, if you could share any insights on those, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I would encourage everyone who's interested in this to Google the Clean Network and expansion of Clean Network. You'll find the statement by Secretary of State Pompeo where he lays out exactly what he means by those. I think it's a category of 5 different areas of clean, perhaps to kind of take a page from the 4 represents. This could be the 5 cleans on the part of the US. But we have on the clean apps, it is this idea that there should be restrictions on applications that are not proven to have good protections of US citizens' data, security technology that's going to protect the information flow, that can assure that there's not going to be censorship of what information may be put on those apps. The clean cloud is effectively making sure that data of US companies, US persons is going to be processed on cloud servers that are also likewise have some assurance of security. And then this idea of the use of US apps by third-party Chinese providers to distribute on phones or systems made outside the United States. This idea that if you have risks in terms of your own telecommunications infrastructure, then you shouldn't have access to US apps that are otherwise secure, because that may reveal flaws or lead to backdoors or what have you. Those concerns are particularly not articulated specifically, but it's interesting to note that in that statement, there's a specific call out of Chinese companies, including Tencent. Also, Alibaba is mentioned, and Baidu. So you have a very much, as you saw with some of the other legislation that's been passed in Congress recently, a willingness to cite to specific Chinese companies and technologies that are of concern.
That's terrific. If I could just shift gears a little bit, and I'd be interested in both of your perspectives. One of the questions that we've received is about TikTok suing the U.S. government about this to restrict the implementation of this executive order. I just wonder if both of you could discuss, there's obviously a national security related issue under IEPA. What do you think the likelihood of success that TikTok will win this case? And is there precedent in the past that you can maybe reference from how these cases have proceeded on this type of request?
Maybe I can.
I was going to say, I want to defer to you on this. So you say something and I'll say I agree with what you said.
Well, it's certainly early days. We have a couple of complaints filed, one by Tencent, of course, and another by a WeChat users group, and by the TikTok lawsuit as well. So I think they're all various flavors of constitutional rights violations, Fifth Amendment due process, free speech, First Amendment issues. And I think each one has slightly different takes on those bases. But historically, of course, there has been tremendous deference shown by U.S. courts to the national security foreign policy authority of the executive branch. And that makes it difficult to bring these cases to a point where they're going to lead to some kind of action being taken by the court, whether that's an injunction or a temporary denial or something like that, that's going to limit the ability of the administration to implement these. And so you can kind of see the litigation play out through a series of appeals. And meanwhile, the executive branch action goes into effect and companies have to live with it, notwithstanding the fact that the appeals are ongoing. So there are a number of challenges there. Not to say that courts won't eventually get to a stage where they're hearing argument on this and potentially reaching some kind of ruling, but it could be a long stretch. And I think you can look no further than some of the litigation involving the use of the CFIUS authority to regulate areas, very similar kinds of areas of concern in terms of investments in the United States by specific investors and specific US businesses, clearly actions targeting specific companies that are being upheld by the Supreme Court as being consistent with the president's foreign policy, national security authority under a number of statutes. I think it's bolstered here, the administration's case is bolstered by some of the recent actions of Congress, particularly the FIRMA legislation I was mentioning earlier, which does carve out, clearly recognizes that personal identifying data is something that has national security links. I think the administration would be likely to point to that in any kinds of case briefing in these cases. So a number of challenges for the litigants here. I think they should not probably expect that there will be a rapid resolution of these cases, and therefore what that means for all the rest of us is we're going to have to look at what Commerce Department comes up with and probably live with it at least for a short period of time, if not, as we've been talking about, medium to long term.
Yes, I want to agree with everything Nate just said. I'll say the precedent that comes to mind for me, there are sort of two classes, neither of which are a perfect analogy. One is the attempt by Kaspersky to sue when the US government tried to block their antivirus, which was not successful. And I think, again, sort of that deference to national security concerns was pretty sort of impossible to overcome. The perhaps more hopeful, but also much more distant in the past precedent that comes to mind is sort of in the 1990s, there are a series of lawsuits around cryptographic software. And this question of sort of when there are these fairly stringent export controls on any kind of cryptography being exported out of the United States, there are like math professors who are trying to teach college classes about crypto, who are being told by their universities they can't post any of the encryption software on their course website because people outside the United States might be able to access it. And there actually is some willingness on the part of courts to say this is sort of a violation of free speech protections to tell somebody that they can't publish an ebook of their cryptography textbook, or they can't publish this. Obviously, very different circumstances in a very different time, but it's sort of the only, off the top of my head, the only analogy I can come up with where you see some willingness of US courts to say, just because there are some security concerns about cryptography software being shared abroad, that's not actually a reason to sort of block this software from being distributed over the internet. I don't really see that happening here, but I do think that there have been moments where I've been surprised by how willing courts have been to push back against the Trump administration, and so I suppose it's possible that I could be surprised here again.
Another question, I think this one, maybe we'll start with Nate, and we'll bring two questions together. In Section 3 of the August 6th 10-cent executive order, there seemed to be some OFAC language that was included. Specifically, it mentioned a constitutional presence, et cetera. Do you think that this language is teeing up a future sanctions regime versus 10 cent, or is this simply a kind of deterrence mechanism? And the second question is more general. Could you game out for us a little bit how the Clean Network Initiative from state might potentially play out across Commerce, OFAC, DOD, and other agencies in the administration? Thanks.
Great questions. Yeah, on the first one, I think, yeah, there is a lot of language in both executive orders that reads like executive orders that establishes the basis for IEPA sanctions under OFAC authority. However, you do have the very clear delegation to Commerce, as I mentioned, and I think there's not been any appetite, at least stated publicly, and again, you have the press reports about recent meetings with the White House, for the administration to take this to the level where it becomes an all-out ban on any kind of direct or indirect financial transaction in goods or services, or even facilitation of such transactions by U.S. persons, which you would typically see under an OFAC regime. This is not something that so far has been explained in those terms, or is so far looking like it would be implemented in those terms. And so I think we have to kind of take that as face value, subject to change. But for now, there's nothing that would seem to indicate we're going to be faced with a position where effectively everybody, including the financial community banks, start to look at transactions with 10 cent more broadly, or try to put in place screening or prohibitions on any kind of transaction. We're not there yet, and I don't think the administration has an appetite to go there based on what I've seen in press reports and other public sources. So I think that's kind of where we're left at the moment. I think if the administration tries this and feels like it becomes an effective restriction on their security concerns about access to data through WeChat, that they may just stop there. But of course, we've also seen with ZTE and Huawei and others where they feel that the initial policy choice is not working, they're willing to ratchet up the tension further. In terms of how the Clean Initiative and the expansion and the 5 cleans that Secretary of State Pompeo has mentioned will be implemented, I think as we've seen with almost everything else on the Trump administration policy towards China, there's a great willingness to kind of take this whole of government approach and use all the tools in the tool basket as needed to try to implement whatever the policy choices are. We've seen this with some of the trade actions. We've seen this in other national security actions as well. And I think we can expect a similar kind of play out here as well. Commerce is kind of the logical choice for a lot of this because of their historic authority in regulating the kinds of technologies that underpin and form the basis for these apps, and both sort of the cloud servers all run on technology typically that the US has jurisdiction over under the export control laws. Unless the software, encryption software is made publicly available, then it still remains subject to regulation under the export control laws. So there's that as well. A number of different touch points. I think there will be probably a reluctance to accelerate or increase the strength of any kind of prohibition by involving OFAC or the Treasury Department, at least in the first round. But We've also seen, of course, recently some of the actions of designating entities like XPCC under some of the U.S. sanctions authority. And so the U.S. is not averse to doing that, but I think so far they want to try to take a measured approach and focus on the underlying technology and some of the touch points of that.
Professor Wolf, any thoughts from you? If not, I can move on to the next question.
Well, I guess I would just say I think sort of the whole notion of the clean network is so profoundly confusing to people who think about cybersecurity that it's very hard for me to imagine it kind of playing out in anything or in any way that really relates to the security of networks and data, right? Because what you think about when you think about securing a network is we know there's going to be an enormous amount of traffic coming from all sorts of sources that we don't know and don't necessarily trust. And how do we use sort of the intermediaries at our disposal, the internet service providers, the software manufacturers, the hardware manufacturers, to try and tamp down on those threats and make sure that whatever impact they have is relatively minimal. And so I think sort of the whole external facing piece of that initiative, in which you say sort of instead of focusing on the US intermediaries here and what they can do to strengthen security, we're going to focus on the sources of that uncleanliness overseas, is a very kind of counterproductive way, at least of trying to achieve security, if that's what this is about.
Let me ask a question that's generally more broadly focused on American citizen data security. Why focus on restricting access to data by certain countries rather than crafting data protections that are more consumer or citizen oriented and give users more control over their own data? Is there a view that focusing on restricting specifically China's access to data is a better approach?
So I think that's probably caught up in a lot of sort of the things that this administration cares about, and in particular, the way that some members of this administration feel about China specifically. And you're right, it's a totally different approach than what you see out of the European Union, where they pass the GDPR and try to kind of put more control and autonomy in the hands of individual users. I think you've never seen a tremendous appetite for that in the United States outside of California. And so that has not been a top priority, certainly for Congress over the past few years, trying to approach data security in that way. I think what you're seeing here is not something that has any real technical security consequences for anybody. It's really about kind of this question of how do you feel about the fact that the Chinese government is going to be able to compel data from some of these companies. And if you view sort of that access as a major national security threat, then that really doesn't have anything to do with whether or not the data is being stored securely or collected securely, whether there are vulnerabilities in the software or the hardware. It just has to do with the question of sort of, do you trust the Chinese government or not? And this administration seems to have come down pretty strongly on the side of, we just don't, right? Nobody has pointed to specific vulnerabilities in Huawei technology and WeChat technology that warrant this kind of action. And so I think what you're seeing is a sort of strategy that is being marketed as a cybersecurity approach that is really about distrust of a particular government and administration, and not at all about sort of consumer protection in the way that the GDPR was designed.
Thank you. One final question, this one for Nate. I have heard that IEPA has never successfully been challenged in court, and that if a case was ever brought to its conclusion, Treasury would settle outside of court. Is that accurate, for one? And second, is there a concern that by leveraging IEPA so much that its authorities could be eroded because it'll be challenged more regularly in the U.S. court system?
Great question. Yeah, I think the first point, absolutely correct. It has survived numerous challenges over the decades, and there is, as we were talking about, significant deference to the National Security Authority under IEPA. I think in large part, that stems from a conclusion by the Supreme Court and others that if Congress wants to scale back some of the executive branch authority under IEPA, it has a very easy route to do so, and that is to pass new legislation that would supplant IEPA. And I think that is probably the more likely route if there's a view that IEPA is being overused and used in ways that Congress is not intending, would be for Congress to take further action to scale it back, rather than the courts necessarily stepping in the form of a lawsuit and saying, well, you need to rewrite the statute this way, or you can't apply it in these circumstances. So that's if you look back over jurisprudence of the Supreme Court over the many decades, that has been a typical response of the court to these kinds of issues, that Congress, if they have written the statute overbroad, they have the right, and it's a political question in many ways, they can go back and rewrite it and constrain the executive branch authority further. I think also one of the challenges for litigants who want to sue the U.S. government over implementation of IEPA is that, first of all, there's a long time frame typically when you sue, and the administration can go ahead and implement during the interim often, but also there's the ability to kind of pull back the orders and go back to the drawing board and rewrite them in a way that might obviate some of the challenges before the court is going to issue its ruling. So that, I think, has also led to the tendency for these cases not to be particularly successful in the courts.
Fantastic. Well, that concludes the Q&A portion of today's program, and I don't think anyone will ever begrudge us giving them 4 minutes back of their time. So once again, thank you, Professor Wolf and Nate, for speaking to our members today. This concludes today's program. Feel free to follow up with any additional questions you might have, and we can connect you with the speakers directly. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.